Now, I know that some of you think in terms of T4 as well as T3. It does seem to me, we stopped at 3. Perhaps we were being too simplistic. But if there's one thing that I think is infinitely clear, whether you're thinking about it as T3 or T4, implementation science has to serve the needs, capabilities, and infrastructure of people who are actually who are committed to making that kind of change. They're not going to know the science, they're going to be desperate for it, but no team of researchers by themselves can get this done. And again, I keep coming back to Marita describing her efforts to improve pain management. And I'll be honest, when I first heard about some of this, I thought, wow, this is really, really complicated. But it was complicated because making it simple, practical, and reliable for frontline nurses, it's complicated stuff going in. Now, anytime that we have a dilemma in science, and we're not sure what the boundaries are, what our charter is, if you will, a starting place on our way to developing theories of change is to actually create frameworks. So one that we supported to a team at RAND with many, many colleagues from around the world was I focused on identifying the need for information about how contexts and implementation processes and their interaction shape the outcomes of implementation strategies. We also have the evidence-based practice centers recommending how to apply a broad consolidated framework for implementation research. So that's available on our website. Now, for PCORI, where there's clearly a short-term, very tangible opportunity for funding, another board member and I actually chair a dissemination work group because, after all, we are PCORI's dissemination partner in part, even though the money does not get allocated to us through PCORI, it comes directly to ARC. So we started thinking about and consulted with a number of people of what would it take to actually build this into grant solicitations. Now, I know that all of you are superb grant writers. So if a grant solicitation says, I want to see a meaningful, compelling dissemination plan, I can set my watch until you can write something that sounds really compelling and is totally undergirded by the best possible intention. But that's not actually what we had in mind. So I'm going to tell you about the checklist, which is really more or less written into all the PCORI funding announcements. There is a school of thought that says that if you prime the pump for selected types of research and identify the people who would be most interested in using the results and keep them engaged with the research process throughout, that will make a big difference in addressing what many have often referred to as the oft-cited 17-year time frame from the time research is funded to the time it improves patient care. So step one then would be identifying which specific stakeholders. Now, I would bet that even within the CTSA program, where many of you have devoted a lot of time and energy to the question of engagement, there is not a clear roadmap or sense of that. I think it's also fair to say PCORI doesn't know what it is, ARC doesn't know what it is. So we thought it was very important that people actually describe the points in the research process at which these stakeholders will be engaged from the earliest planning throughout the conduct of the work. I want to be really clear, there's not a prior hypothesis here. But this is precisely what I would say is missing from almost all journal articles, because I guess it's deemed not terribly interesting, but that's what we need to learn much, much more. What does engagement mean? Is that a once-a-year meeting? Is it a weekly newsletter? Is it, tweeting people every hour? I don't think we have a clue. And so specifically, the next point on the checklist is describing how you will engage stakeholders at each identified point, and then being really clear about a governance plan. I know that the CTSAs have a very, very active community engagement group, and anyone who's been involved in community engagement know that it takes a great deal of time. But I think all of us are aware of studies where the community was engaged throughout, from the very first step in the process right through, the end in publishing results, except they weren't consulted about publishing. So the next step is, describing how you'll convey the study results to stakeholders and so forth, and frankly, describing how you'll identify facilitators and barriers to the dissemination of the results, thinking about it ahead of time. One of the really terrific projects HHS was able to fund with Recovery Act resources was a series of case studies led by Eric Schneider from RAND. Any of you who are going to the Academy Health meeting next month, he will be presenting this in a panel session. And they essentially looked at 6 very, very well-known studies and tried to assess with in-depth case studies why it was that they didn't have a bigger impact. And that's all I'm going to tell you because I don't want to steal his thunder, but I expect that it will be in print shortly. And then the last very sensitive issue, describe how you will allocate and share resources with stakeholders. Do I think this is a perfect list? No. I'm simply sharing it by virtue of the fact that many of you may be thinking of applying, and I think it is a starting point, and I have no doubt whatsoever that many of you could write a much better list. But what excites me is the opportunity to learn as people grapple with these specific questions. So the really good news for people in implementation science is that there's new opportunities for funding and training, including improving healthcare delivery systems and accelerating the methods. I mentioned the Keystone project, and what's also great about the Keystone project is that they were actually able to sustain their results long after the grant funding went away. So clearly, what they had come up with was not just a very successful intervention, but one that was sustainable. So my bottom line here is that now is the time for implementation science to stake its claim in healthcare transformation. Now, clearly, as I said at the outset, this is kind of challenging business. I actually sat down with a team of colleagues, and this included people from nursing, from hospital administration, from engineering, and so on and so forth in Milwaukee several years ago. And what I learned in hearing about their work was how much time they invested in double-checking terms. If you say X, is this what you mean, or is it something else? That's more work than speaking with people who already think and use the same vocabulary as you and research colleagues. But the payoff is ultimately that these are the members of the team who can actually take the results of successful implementation in science and scale it in a way that we're still struggling to learn. So I will close with what I hope is an inspirational proverb, which I heard from a colleague at HHS. I believe it's a Swahili proverb that says, if you want to travel fast, you travel alone. But if you want to go far, you travel with others. And the last thing I will do is just make a brief public service announcement that we are having our annual meeting in September this year, same place as previously. And with that, I really want to thank you for your attention and the opportunity to do this remotely because of other commitments on this end, and would be delighted to take questions and so forth.